Yeah, film. Yeah, films. We watched some films. Now let's talk about those films.
Hello. For a second, I was like, what?
What is surprise?
What's the surprise? Was I prepped beforehand?
You were.
But I am privy to this decision. Gabe and I have switched roles today. So hi, I'm going to do the media analysis time. Hopefully you don't hate it. And you're like, Kat, go back to history. You suck at this. Just kidding. I don't know.
No.
I think it'll probably be fine. But primarily we have switched because my special interest in hyperfixation is almost always video games. I am a gamer and spend the majority of my spare time doing so. Literally almost at the detriment of like all of my responsibilities and relationships. I love gaming so much. And today we'll be talking about The Last of Us, both games, the first and the second, which is known for its very effective display of intense emotion and instilling the in-game player a complex understanding of the human experience. This game does an amazing job of showing the layers of humanity, the ways in which people are complicated. I had played this game when it first came out, and I remember, Gabe, we even did a Twitch stream about it, and it was mostly you'd be like, why do they keep seeing me? Because it's a stealth game, and it's just very hard to do if you don't like to do stealth time.
It's one of the big reasons why you're doing this part and not me.
Yeah. I love stealth. It's actually my favorite game mechanic. So when I saw it was on the PlayStation Now store, the second one, I was like, oh my gosh, this is fate. We can do an episode about both of them because I had replayed it. And I think when we were discussing Eco Horror, you and I both made eye contact. We're like, The
Last of Us.
So this game was amazing in many ways, but it also really scratched the apocalypse itch and made me realize, honestly, that I probably shouldn't have an apocalypse itch for my gameplay. In hindsight, it's not that fun to be in an actual apocalypse. It's fun when you're in a game, but it's not. This game does a really great job reminding you that the real apocalypse would probably be a really bad time and you don't actually want to experience it.
Not a good escape when we're in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah. And I will say, the first game, I remember it hitting really hard, but it was the second game that, ruined me, but in, a good way. It was so unbelievably emotional and made me feel things that I did not expect to feel, made me feel for characters I didn't expect to sympathize with, and also just, shifted who I was rooting for throughout the entire game, which is something that I feel doesn't always happen. Usually games will set you up with a clear villain, demonize that villain to the point where you're like, all right, I'm cool murdering everything to help my protagonist get through this situation. It flips that on its head and is like, nah, but that's bad probably, and you're going to feel accountable for your actions now. And ow is all I really got to say about that, but it was necessary and really good. For those of you who have never played the title, either title of the game, it's very stressful. The monsters are actually challenging, and the world is realistic in ways that are visceral and very uncomfortable. Both games do horror really well. If you are not a stealth player, though, I warn you that this will probably be a very frustrating game to get through, and we've played it for you, essentially, so you don't have to
watch
if that's
Kat's
not
Twitch
your favorite.
streams on it.
Yeah, and honestly, after playing it, and it's very long, I want to redo it again, just through reading about it and talking about it. What makes these games great? They're honest, even when you don't want them to be. There are some people who feel like that's what made it maybe not a great game. I disagree, very strongly. The Last of Us really shines as a game, not because it's especially unique in the premise or story, but it's specifically in its approach to gameplay and story development. You're given characters that hurt heroes, who have spent their time in the apocalypse as brutal as anyone else, and characters who have lost most of the people they love and desperately cling to those they have left. Like any apocalypse narrative, the people in the game are scarier than the monsters, although the monsters are still pretty darn scary. The first game, The Last of Us 2013, 20 years after a pandemic has radically changed known civilization, infected humans run wild, and survivors are killing each other for food, weapons, and whatever they can get their hands on. Joel, a violent survivor, is hired to smuggle a 14-year-old girl, Ellie, out of an oppressive military quarantine zone, but as what starts as a small job soon transforms into a brutal journey across the US. This is developed by Naughty Dog. The first game lets you start in an unexpected way. You start as Joel's daughter, so before Ellie's even introduced, pre-apocalypse, and you get this background on how Joel ends up the way he does 20 years later. What you learn is that Joel's daughter does not make it on this journey, and the 20 years after that loss has left Joel somewhat numb and callous. Since the story centers on the first 20 years post-apocalypse, the remains of government in society are still pretty prevalently the problem that the in-game character must face, at least at the beginning. There's a government-run soldiers that over-police the remaining population, a guerrilla organization that rises up against them, and the other people who find themselves outside of both spheres desperately trying to fight each other to survive or just rebuild wherever they can. The group that they highlight throughout the game that preach the goal of helping rebuild what is classified as a more humane society are called the Fireflies. The method of the Fireflies are like that of any other revolutionary force. The government in this world is familiar, handling the situation horribly, mismanaging supplies, acting brutally and bureaucratically. The first game sets you up with Joel and Tess, who in an attempt to recover guns that are stolen from them, meet up with Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, who asks them to take Ellie, a 14-year-old kid, across town to the members of her group. You get to an introduction to the spore-based monsters and the various stages of their development. And these monsters are both visually and auditorily scary. So, even their fear distribution is accessible because there's more than one way in which the characters themselves present as being terrifying. The monsters themselves are pretty unique compared to other zombies, and Gabe will get into whether or not what they're doing and what if they could happen. Why are we scared of mushrooms and spores? There's a good reason, and Gabe will get into that in her section. But spoilers for the first game. We're obviously going to spoil a lot of stuff in this, but if you have not played the first game and you'd like to, go do that now. It is pretty long, but it is very fun. Once you get a bit further into the game, you learn a secret about Ellie, the 14-year-old kid, that they are immune to bites, spores, and monsters. Ellie must get to the Fireflies base across the country to work with doctors on a possible cure. That's the big reveal of the game, and you really just have to follow Joel and Ellie as they first find out that they don't have to just travel across town, but instead have to travel from one side of the country to the other. The middle of the game. Oh, yeah. There's an apocalypse. There's spore monsters. There's other survivors who really want to murder them. Or just really paranoid and reasonably so, or just having a hard time surviving. I'm going to kind of go quickly through the first game because I really want to talk about the second game more, but the middle of the game is essentially filled with Joel and Ellie bonding through a father-daughter kinship in an effort, as I said, I'm going to rush through, but there are many impactful emotional scenes that happen throughout the game that hit you really hard, I think, especially considering the pandemic life that we're living right now. Characters that you don't want to see die that do, and brutally so. This game is as brutal as I think the actual apocalypse would be. While it's fun to think of what would happen in some wacky scenario in which society actually collapses, this game is quick to tell you how harsh and unforgiving that world will be. And as you approach the end of The Last of Us 1, Joel faces an ethical dilemma that would make myself and Sheedy from The Good Place's head explode. It's one I think a lot of people would struggle with when given the choice between an uncertain cure in the life of a child who you've begun to love as your own. There is no good answer. The Fireflies doctor informs Joel that to even attempt to find a cure, Ellie will have to die. Why? I don't know. The game tells you that. You just kind of have to. One thing I really like about these games actually is that you don't really get to make some of the choices that are less appealing. You don't you actually have to just live with consequences that you're living through this narrative storytelling. But the player doesn't really get to deliberate at all. You just have to make that choice. And while it is arguably selfish choice to save Ellie that has a lot of societal implications, I get why Joel does this. And the game kind of ends in this kind of middle space between you wondering what happens next what really happened at the Firefly's base, what really happened leading up to that. And that's something that does get answered in the second game. There are some people who feel like maybe it didn't need to be said, but I disagree. I think this game was amazing, and definitely needed to be said. And so to give you a little synopsis of The Last of Us Part 2, 5 years after the dangerous journey across the post-pandemic United States, Ellie and Joel have settled down in Jackson, Wyoming. Living amongst a thriving community of survivors has allowed them peace and stability, despite the constant threat of an infected or the other desperate survivors. When a violent event disrupts the peace, Ellie embarks on a relentless journey to carry out justice and find closure. As she hunts those responsible down one by one, she is confronted with the devastating physical and emotional repercussions of her actions. And boy, does she. The second game is what I'm really excited to talk about. Being 5 years after the Firefly incident, you see Ellie coming into early adulthood. She's 19 in this version of this game, in a stable environment despite growing up in the literal apocalypse. In Jackson, they have security, electricity, somewhat normal home living arrangements, kids and playgrounds, and nice times behind giant gates. The adults who live in the town go on patrols for supplies and remove infected that stalk the areas outside. Joel and Ellie have some kind of falling out that you explore throughout the entire game that ties back to the ending of the first game. They have built somewhat of a normal life here, though, and while many of the population is still very traumatized by the world outside and the things that they've had to do to create this space, there's something kind of beautiful about this little haven they've created. The second game really does an amazing job showcasing the impact of this trauma that the characters are dealing with, and how mental health in the apocalypse is really complicated. Because even with the veiled comfort of suburbia in this rebuilt society, there is no real safety in this world, in this apocalypse. And there's like this veil that Ellie is kind of having, like, wow, they're having a nice upbringing post that incident. Like, they have made friends, they have learned things in like a safe space to like kind of heal. Mm-hmm. And then that veil is like ripped away by what happens.
It's kind of like Walking Dead. They always do that.
Yeah.
Once they settle, it's like, oh, now you're dead.
Yeah, now everyone you love is gone.
Yeah.
And you're reminded that the world sucks. The big theme for the second game is vengeance. There is this cycle of pain that had me feeling Naruto Shippuden, pain arc vibe, level sadness. Except Ellie is not Naruto. That's something that we will... Have you seen it, you know.
Not knuckleheaded ninja.
Yeah, there are so many threads that are happening all at once, so bear with me as I try to express everything. Like, so much happens in this game. It is so long. It's really hard to, like, tie all the threads together. So for me, the second game hurt. Like, in a way where you're glad you played it, but also really sad for a while afterwards. I think it hit a lot of players hard for that reason, both because it's so long, and the content featured is arguably could have been spread across 2 games instead of 1. It's all crammed in there. So there's so much ouch all in one space that just feels like it goes on forever, which I guess honestly is a nice metaphor for how the actual apocalypse would be. You don't get to turn it off actually in those, like, it just keeps going. So it really leaves you feeling emotionally tired and regular tired once you finally get to the ending. The biggest thing that really shocked me about the way that the story took the game, though, is that by the end, I was really irked by Ellie, like, with her insistence on continuing to pursue vengeance when love and support were waving their arms dramatically in front of her, begging her to stay. It's also one of those things I actually really appreciated about the game, though, because it was honest. And it created, like, this feeling of, like, understanding that people are that frustratingly stubborn. That was a human response to the situation. And as the story forces you to kind of just continue to go, when honestly, there are many times where I was like, why can't she just stay and be happy? Why? Mm-hmm. She has people who love her. And then it's like, but when you've experienced, like, you don't see that. It feels inauthentic. So it was just very honest. It was very real. And when it really showcased the way that processing loss and seeking revenge, like, what would happen and what does happen when those things take place.
The tunnel vision.
Yeah. And this was not lost on me, albeit very draining. Spoilers for the second game. So why does Ellie want to revenge murder so bad? The second title, Joel is brutally killed by a newly introduced character, Abby, and supported by a group of characters that we later learn are former Fireflies. After watching a video from the creators of the game, I think they achieved what they were trying to do with this. They set out to create a game about the cycle of violence and the consequences that the choice to pursue and continue that cycle has on the in-game characters that are both good and bad. It holds you accountable in ways that I have not seen a game do ever. There's a cyclical sacrifice that takes place throughout that if you're coming from the first title may be really hard to swallow. Many players who plan to come to this second title looking for a story centered on Ellie and Joel growing together through the apocalypse, kind of just an extension of the first game. It does not do that. Joel is murdered very early, and while there are many critiques of this choice, and by specifically the level of exposition that takes place, this game forces you to follow Abby, the child of the doctor that Joel murders to save Ellie from the Fireflies, for like half of the game. I feel these critiques because a lot of them are valid, but the gameplay was a lot. And I felt that frustration as well, where at the beginning of that story development, I kept waiting anxiously to get back to Ellie. I felt myself getting really conflicted with my in-game choices, not wanting to sympathize with Joel's murderer because that made the first half of the game where I'm tasked with revenge murdering a lot of people feel significantly heavier than a fake world video game time has ever forced me to feel. And although that was a lot, I thought it was a really brave choice for them to make. And I think it's something that we needed because it's way easier to commit atrocities when you dehumanize the enemy. That's why our country is the way that it is. So for a game to challenge that and force the player into feeling this level of uncomfortability as well as accountability was just really cool as an idea for me. The critiques of this game also highlight the lack of subtlety the game has, the lack of nuance. So it's kind of like No Nuance November, but the whole time. And the shift from the character development to theme pushing. And I get those critiques, but I also really enjoyed the characters that direction allowed us to meet. I think this was maybe the game a lot of people didn't want to receive, but it was the game that they needed to receive. And it was an experience that kind of forced an empathy shift that is heavily applicable to real life. I welcome the nod back to the fact that Joel and Ellie were never supposed to be heroes. They needed those consequences. They did lots of effed up things throughout their entire journey that, like, in any other scenario would have real and lasting consequences.
And selfish things.
Yeah, like very selfish things that it's like that thing where it's like, if you're gonna kill somebody, you gotta kill the whole thing. Because otherwise they're going to come for you. And wow, that is messed up. So it's like, honestly, like they did not deserve a happy ending.
Yeah.
Any more or less than any of the other characters who are introduced in this game. Like, if anything, Ellie is a villain by the end of this. Or at least you understand why they don't get to be happy. So, it really shows us why the apocalypse is only fun in theory and why the reality of what would actually happen is much more brutal than anyone would actually want to experience in real life. This game does amazing things for accessibility. Specifically, the game had over 60 accessibility features, which are featured on the Naughty Dog website. The website even has a configuration of these presets based on need. In hindsight, I realized I used all the hearing accessibility presets.
Nice.
Because of how my brain processes sound on a sensory level usually makes it very challenging to play sounds. And it also impacts like my ability to process what's visually happening and like auditorily happening. So the game, you can like add arrows to point like where the monster sounds are coming from, and like vibration cues for when certain actions need to take place, and as well as like the size and level of detail that your subtitles contain. So that was just really cool. There was also vision and motor accessibility presets and extensive variations in control options to customize the experience to fit the needs of the player. Considering how amazing this game is with representation, storytelling, etc., it's not surprising to me that they would also take the time to make the game as accessible to as many like differently abled players as possible. To get a full rundown of all the accessibility features, I recommend checking out Naughty Dog's website, which we can include in the description of the video. Representation was something The Last of Us 2 also did really well. This game did something pretty amazing with representation, specifically, as expected, because of that, Naughty Dog has received a decent amount of hate for its positive portrayal of women, lesbian, bi, trans, and BIPOC characters, especially for integrating those characters so heavily into the world and story, creating complex, emotional, human characters instead of just like caricatures and fodder. In an article from VentureBeat titled "Why the Story of The Last of Us Part 2 is Maddening and Fulfilling," spoilers, by Dean Takahashi, the creators claim this as a badge of honor. What's happening is what we wanted. People are having conversations, said Haley Gross, narrative lead at Naughty Dog. Interview with GameBeat. This is an inciting debate about good and evil. It's how far games can get pushed narratively about what makes a redemptive person and what makes a redemptive story. As long as people are asking those questions, I feel like we've accomplished what we have wanted to accomplish. This game does an amazing job where lots of like dystopian and fantasy novels fail, specifically that it actually just like heavily integrates the fact that non-white people exist, non-heteronormative people exist. They exist in the apocalypse too. And it's just like really, really cool. As a pan-Jewish gender fluid human, I love the representation in this game. I felt seen in a lot of the characters, including Dina, who is Ellie's love interest, Lev, the trans character, and Ellie, for real, honestly. These characters were amazing, and their capacity to be both good, evil, cruel, compassionate was so realistic that while I was exhausted by the end of the game, I was also thrilled that the game did what it did. I felt like frustration initially with how long I had to walk in Abby's shoes. Since the beginning, I didn't really care for her, but my feelings around Abby's character transformed exponentially as I went. I was so excited for the introduction of Lev, a trans boy dealing with so much in addition to the whole apocalypse. While the line of the story made the game significantly longer and is where many pointed the bulk of their critique, it was one of my favorite parts of the game. Could they have made that a whole separate game? Probably, but that's what honestly has me hoping for the future, a sequel that unpacks that part of the world further. So for those who've played it or those who haven't, there is a cult that develops in the game where their character of Lev and Yara, they're from the Sephites. I think I said it right. Seraphites. And the other organization that Abby, the main antagonist, is from is called the WLF, and they fight because one group is like kind of free of infected, has this like cult following. They kind of go backwards in time in terms of like technology that they're allowed to use. And that is where Lev and Yara are from. But it was really interesting, and I would love to have like a third game which focuses more heavily on Lev and Yara's backstory and this really interesting cult-like community that develops on this island free of infected. There's also like people who said that like Joel and Ellie's relationship felt more meaningful than the development of Lev and Abby, which I would completely disagree. There was so much left of me like feeling so strongly emotionally, but also like wondering what would happen to Abby and Lev after Ellie leaves them on the beach at the end. And I thought it was so cool, and I am so ready for another sequel where it's just Lev and Abby taking on the world together, finding the Fireflies, because that's kind of what they were trying to do. Where maybe even because Ellie has murder revenged everyone and is now miserable and sad and has no purpose, can be the cure guy again. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Maybe in the third one, because they realize how fruitless this revenge murder cycle is, maybe they all team up and find a cure. And then we get a background on Lev and Abby, and we get all this like more information for this new story. Because honestly, anyone who says like it's not as meaningful, just maybe this game wasn't meant for them. So there's apparently a plot pitch for The Last of Us 3, which is confirmed by a Game Rant article that I am here for and ready to give my money. I think they achieved something here that surprised everyone and did so in a way that was raw and painful and necessary for people who usually don't see themselves in games. So the people who don't get it might need to put on their media analysis glasses and recognize that maybe they weren't the target audience for this game.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Yeah. You got like 98% of the games. Let somebody else have some time in game now.
Like what? Okay, so there's one that's not for you.
And also the main protagonists were still freaking white ladies. So like, what do you want?
Yeah. And
so like even steps forward, there's still room that needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, hearing about the fact that you like play through 11, what I think is interesting about them having it be a part of the main game and not this like side thing is that it's forcing people to have to play it, which I'm sure is what everyone was complaining about, was that they were forced to play this experience. But I think like as media creators, that is so bold and necessary to be like, this is an experience that exists and you all have to, you got to do it because it's real, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
and like that was like the whole game, honestly. Like for like it was so much like this hurts. And you need to understand that though. Like you need to empathize and have like emotions. Cause like, yeah, the world is horrible, but you still have to feel things. And we're gonna make you feel things again. You might not want to see that people exist in this world, but you have to if you want to play this game.
Yeah.
You don't really get a choice. They did so much across the board. There's like so many threads that I like forgot this one part. Like they show the manifestation of like PTSD and like other like mental health things that would obviously take place in an apocalypse scenario where you're murdering so much. Where like the character Ellie, like as they're going through the game, you see even like the characters that talk to each other that she's murdering, she'll murder someone and they'll be like, Johnny, no. Like the other people. So like you'll feel the impact of as that's happening. Or like as Ellie progresses throughout, like she gets more brutal as she goes. It goes like from, geez, I wish I didn't have to do this to F you, go just die, gritting teeth and like really like murdering like extra hard. And like it's so as the character goes, like they transform in like such a drastic way that honestly it's like it seems like that's what Joel was trying to protect her from, but then in dying, like that's off the table. Like he didn't want her to seek revenge, but she did. And like even Tommy, the brother of Joel, like the same thing happens to him. He has like a happy life in this town, Joel's brother. And like as they're going, he's at first like, Ellie, don't do this. I'll do it for you. I'm going to protect you in the name of Joel. And then at the end, he's the one he gets shot by Abby and like injured in a way that like hurts him like long term, where he has trouble walking. And his entire perspective is like, what do you mean you're not going to go revenge murder this lady? I see that you have this wonderful life with a baby and your love of your life here on a farm with goats and happiness. I want you to abandon that because that lady hurt me. And I think it's your responsibility to go murder her because that's what Joel would have wanted. Where it's like, no, it's not what they would have wanted. You're literally lost your purpose. And like, even in the cult, there's like all this stuff where like when they started, there were lots of messaging that have been like warped. So it was like also a critique on like how religion could be warped in like an apocalypse scenario to justify or has been used to justify like atrocities throughout human history. Where it's like the teachings of the thing are totally lost to the people who are in charge and who are using that as a means to just like brutalize their communities and other people. And justify murdering other people, like make them nameless, dehumanize them so that it's their survival's more important than yours. But yeah, they do so many amazing things.
And we are more deserving of living. Yeah,
that's not true. Or at least like you got to get it, you know.
Yeah,
it's such a good game.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Like all the different levels of that because the apocalypse is so complex and it's so interesting for a game especially for the second game to be less about like let's go kill the clickers and the monsters that are happening or like even talk about the fact that like why we're here and people get sick. Because, like, in zombie, like, that's really, like, happening as well. Is like, there's also the threat of zombies. But the real fear, even in something like The Walking Dead, is, like, the people. Like, you just got to deal with regular folk who are trying to live and are, like, really crazy
and, like, could have been happy. Like, they rebuilt stuff, but then chose revenge instead.
Mm-hmm. People be like that.
Yeah.
Well, with that being said, let me go. It's my